Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for letting us to have this opportunity to present the um, Secretariat's, essentially the proposal for the management procedure and all the different components of that. Um, so first of all, before I go through this, well, first of all, I want to mention that some of this might be familiar to you. It's been presented at different meetings and stuff like the SAC and everything at different sort of levels of complexity and details. Um, However, in this presentation, we've added a couple of things like the exceptional circumstances, which is new. They're very similar to last year, but they might be new to most people. But also we've added some context to put the management procedure in terms of the multi-species aspects of the management of tropical tunas in the Eastern Pacific. This hopefully will help you uh, decide on what aspects of the management procedure are relevant. And so one way of thinking about the tropical tuna purseine fishery in the Eastern Pacific Ocean is to put it in three main fisheries. The first fishery is the purseine fishery setting on yellowfin associated with dolphins, which essentially catches mostly yellowfin tuna. Now, the second major fishery is the purseine fishery sitting on floating objects. And the majority of the catch in this fishery is skipjack tuna, but it also catches quite a lot of yellowfin and big-eye tuna. And that's one reason why the multi-species, multi-stock management procedure is needed, because this fishery will interact with the purseine fishery on dolphins because it's catching yellowfin as well. And then the third major component is the longline fishery that generally targets big-eye tuna. And again, because the purseine fishery on floating objects is catching a lot of big-eye tuna, it interacts with this fishery as well. So you can see that having a multi-species and maybe even multi-stock management procedure is important to try and appropriately manage all three species, since they interact in terms of the fisheries. There's also other fisheries, particularly historically, there was the bait boat fishery, things like that. But the other major fishery that I'm not going to sort of focus on here is the fishery on unassociated schools. And a lot of the vessels that fishing on yellowfin or fishing on floating objects will also make some unassociated school sets depending on availability. And there may even be vessels that do majority of unassociated schools, but in our context, it's more the other fisheries that we have to concern about in terms of managing the different species. So early on in the purseine fishery, the majority of the fishing was on yellowfin associated with dolphins. And so because of that, the management focused on maximizing the yield for yellowfin tuna. And it was done in several different ways. There was a particular area where catch limits were applied, or closures were applied, called the CYRA. But there was also, at some stages, there was limits on the capacity and the length of the season. So in the mid-1990s, a new fishery developed or expanded, which was a fishery on floating objects, particularly artificial fish aggregating devices, FADs. And this fishery mainly catches skipjack, but it also catches a lot of yellowfin and, in particular, big-eye tuna. And so management needs to consider these species, particularly big-eye tuna. And the type of set that a vessel conducts is an important consideration to ensure the appropriate management of these different species. There was some attempts to manage these species independently in terms of trying to more focusedly control the management of the different fisheries, but that wasn't really successful in the terms of being adopted by the Commission and supported by stakeholders. So generally, the management was based on the species requiring the strictest management, and this was typically big-eye tuna due to the high vulnerability of big-eye in the floating object fishery. So this here gives you a little bit of a timeline of that context. Early on, there was the pole and line fishery and then the development of the purse seine fishery. And so in the 70s and 90s, management was focusing more on yellowfin tuna. However, during the 90s, there was the expansion of that floating object fishery. And in 2000, there was a specific management measure at the floating object fishery, which was the 3-month closure. But that didn't last. So in 2002, we actually moved towards a complete closure of the EPO for a whole month. And so that's when this current management measures kind of start, where the seasonal closures are on the whole EPO. In 2016, there was an attempt to try and differentiate management between yellowfin and big eye with catch limits. But that didn't work out because there was, I think it was a very high recruitment of yellowfin tuna coming through. And so the catch limits of yellowfin were caught very quickly. And so the fishery was going to be closed. And so there was an interim sort of management decision made where the closures were used instead of the catch limits. And then more recently, there's also been an attempt to manage the species separately, which is the big eye individual vessel thresholds. And that's been very successful. It greatly reduced the catch in the floating object fishery of big eye. And so that's been going for several years. And that's actually been so successful that the closures of the EPO were reduced this year because of that. Okay. This just gives you a little bit of an idea of how the closures have changed over time. Starting off with the 1 month in 2002, sorry. And then slowly, didn't slowly, but increased at sort of certain periods during that, during the time series of the fishery, mainly due to probably the increasing number of sets on floating objects and the higher fishing mortality in big eye tuna. And then, as I mentioned before, there's a reduction in the current year due to the success of the IBT. Okay, and so just wanted to reiterate some of the things that I mentioned there is separately managing vessels, trips, and sets based on set type wasn't considered practical by stakeholders, so it never caught on. And again, the management continued to focus on capacity limits. That's fishing vessel capacity, which is kind of controlled, and then closure for the total EPO. And this is a very inefficient way to manage tropical tunas in terms of maximizing yield for the different species. But it was an approach that was acceptable by stakeholders, and that's why it continued. So I kind of reiterating what I mentioned before is that there was a continued increase in the number of floating object sets, which from the assessments suggested that there should be more days of closure. But because the closure days were getting high, this motivated stakeholders to consider alternative management measures like the IBT, which was successful and reduced the catch of big eye tuna and the fishing mortality of big eye tuna. And one thing that's caused is now big eye tuna is no longer the species of most concern. And actually yellowfin tuna has become the focus of our management. Okay, so now putting that in context in terms of the management and the management strategy evaluation. So preferably what you'd want to do would be a fully explicit multi-stock management and multi-species or multi-stock management strategy evaluation. But to do this, you need to develop multi-species objectives. You need to be able to separate management of the stocks so that you can more finely tune the management in terms of stocks and species. Also develop a multi-stock MSE. So this is quite complicated. You all have realized that the management strategy evaluation took quite a long time to do. We're still trying to work out management objectives for big eye tuna. So this approach, a full explicit multi-stock management and MSE will probably take several years to develop and implement. But you also should realize that the current harvest control rule, this interim harvest control rule that was put in place a few years back, is actually a simplified multi-stock harvest control rule. And it's based on assessing all of the stocks and determining then which stock requires the most restrictive management and managing it based on that. So it is taking into consideration all three species. And so the proposed management procedure that the staff is putting forward, and we're putting it forward as an interim management procedure, is based on the same concept in terms that we evaluate all three, or actually in this case 4, because there's 2 yellowfin tuna stocks that we're considering. We evaluate all of those using assessments and the harvest control rule for each, and then determine which one requires the most restrictive management and base it on that. So again, it's basically something that you've been doing already, and it is also a multi-stock one, but maybe not a fully explicit with multi-stock management objectives, but at least it's trying to consider those. And we believe it's reasonable in the interim. It's also more precautionary than just doing a single management procedure on big eye tuna because it takes into consideration the other 2 species. And what we recommend is that during the first 2 management cycles, being 3 years each, which is 6 years, that we do the necessary work to develop multi-species objectives, develop ways to more focus the management on the different stocks, do multi-stock MSE if we think it's needed, and also some research to improve the stock assessments so that we can actually fine-tune the management, and then reevaluate the management procedure, I guess, within those 6 years, so that in the 3rd management cycle we can adopt and implement a more fully explicit multi-stock management procedure. Okay, so a little bit more background. So in 2025, we evaluate all 3 of the tuna stocks. We're all sorts of species, and 2 stocks for yellowfin tuna were considered using benchmark assessments, and they were all found to be in healthy condition. Again, the big eye was linked to the success of the individual vessels threshold. And so We also proposed a management procedure, which is very similar to the one we're still putting forward, but it hadn't been MSE tested. But that wasn't adopted, and the commission decided to just adopt a change in the closure, which went from 72 days to 64 days. So this year, the management strategy evaluation was completed, and we evaluated a range of harvest control rules. We found 3 of them met the management objectives. We also had an updated big eye tuna stock assessment that showed that the fishing mortality on juveniles continued to decline and the biomass was increasing. And there's also risks of exceeding the reference points were very low. That's for big eye tuna. And we also did some interim multi-species management strategy evaluations that found that the big eye tuna harvest strategy also met the yellowfin and skipjack status and safety objectives. And we also showed using some yield analysis that there's a potential large increase, like 50% increase possible for skipjack if the effort in the fishery increased. This is just reiterating the status of the 3 species. And in big eye tuna here, yellowfin tuna, there's 2 different stocks: a northeast stock, which covers the main dolphin associated fishery, and then a southwest, which is predominantly floating object fishery. But all 3 species in the 2 yellowfin stocks are all in good health. And in fact, the southwest yellowfin stock is the one that requires the most restrictive. Okay, so I'm just going to go over some results of the MSE, the multi-species MSE, and then describe the proposed management procedure. Okay, so management objectives have not been adopted for big eye tuna. However, there's been a lot of discussion over the many years that we've been talking about management strategy evaluation. And from those, the staff was able to pull out 6 main objectives relating to safety, such as the limit reference points, the status of the Kobe plots, stability in the catch, high yields, allowing the fishery to be open for a longer time, and also the abundance being high, and that's related to also having high catch rates for the longline fisheries. So we evaluated several harvest control rules. They all had the same format, where we had a target fishing mortality, which was applied unless the population went below a control point, where the fishing mortality would be reduced towards 0 as the spawning biomass decreased. These are the strategies that harvest control rules that we tested, and they all differed based on the target fishing mortality or the control point. The first one is the staff proposed strategy, which is what we proposed last year based on what we call our best scientific information without testing it. And that's the least conservative strategy. And that's also the one we're proposing this year as well. One thing that is important to note here is that all of the harvest control rules included a limit on how much the number of days can can change each 3-year management cycle. And that was 10 days unless the stock size was below the control point, and then the closure could increase by up to 20 days. But by doing that, because of the very good status of big eye tuna now, the closures decreased, but only slowly over time. And even after, whatever, was it 30 years? No, how many years was it? 21 years, sorry. The closure actually probably hadn't got to the equilibrium level that would be predicted by that harvest control. So in terms of the performance of the different harvest control rules, the main trade-off is between the probability being in the green part of the Kobe plot and the number of days of closure. And so the more closure you have, the more likely you're going to be in the green part of the Kobe plot. But also note that the probabilities are still very high here. But the closure day is actually, I guess, quite significant. And then also, as that trade-off changes, also the amount of purseine catches change too, with higher catches. This is catches of big eye tuna, which is not necessarily the objective to maximize in this fishery. The higher catches of big eye on lower days of closure, more fishing. So here's the results from the MSE. Some of these results don't show, well, in this case, there's a very low probability of breaching the limit reference points, so that's not really something that can be used to choose among the different harvest control rules. Also, three of these are actually very similar across all the harvest control rules. Some of them have quite high average closure days, and we've noticed that more than the 72 days of closure has caused concern. That's why the IVT was introduced. So those tend to be not likely to be favorable for stakeholders. This one also had a high number of closures days. This one here has a moderate probability that the change in closure days is 20 days, which is not really, in the past has shown to be a change that's probably too high. And so that leaves us with 3 harvest control rules that we considered met the management objectives. And then, as you can see here, this is the one we're proposing, which generally has the same performance of the other 2, except for the closure days is generally lower. Okay. But going back to the limit on the number of days of closure that can change between management cycles, it happens very slowly. And so given the healthy status of big eye tuna, perhaps we should be allowing for a greater reduction in the closure days, particularly initially. And so to look at that, we ran an analysis where we didn't put a limit on how much the number of closure days could change in the first management cycle. And so from that, which is the bottom one here, and it's only in the first cycle that we remove the limit, you can see that the performance of that particular harvest management procedure is very similar to the one where we had the 10-day limit on it. Okay, and so we only did one test. However, this indicates that anywhere between what happens here, which I think was it like an 8-day closure in the first, how many days of closure was it in the first cycle on average?
For the second no limit.
Yeah.
0.
Zero. Okay, so the closure was completely eliminated in that first cycle. And so anywhere, any management procedure that has anywhere between a 10-day reduction and a full elimination of the closure will meet the management objectives. And it's been tested with MSE. So it gives us a very wide range of options in terms of the first management cycle if we choose this particular harvest control rule. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the multi-species MSE. So as I mentioned earlier, Big Eye is no longer the species of most concern. And so what we did was we took the the harvest control rule for Big Eye tuna and based on that, what days closure would occur, we wanted to check to see if that would be okay in terms of the status of yellowfin and skipjack. So for each management cycle, we took the days of closure, adjusted the fishing mortalities for yellowfin and skipjack, and see if that the resulting fishing mortality would be a concern for the status or the safety of yellowfin and skipjack. And so that's comparing it to the limit and the target fishing mortality reference points. We also made an inference from that, even though we didn't project the spawning biomass in the future for those two species, which changes depending on the fishing mortalities. We did make some sort of rough inferences about whether or not the spawning biomass would be in a good status or safety. So this is just showing you what we did. So in the first, so we're taking, it's this bottom orange line here that we're using. So we just took the days of closure here and adjusted the fishing mortality based on that in the first cycle. We did the same thing. But essentially what we really are looking at is what the safety would be here at the end, because it's the fishing mortality that's important, and that's the highest fishing mortality down. And so this is looking at these results for the most or the stock that requires the most restrictive management, which is that southwest yellowfin tuna stock, which is the area in the yellow here, and this is the northeast is the other stock. And so this here is for the target. And so you can see that here with the mean fishing mortality is lower than the F30 target. And this is plus or minus 80%. So there's a 10% probability that it would be above the gray line here. But still, this is the target. So we're basically below the target fishing mortality. So that's going to give us, put us in the green quadrant of the Kobe plot, and this is just looking at it as individual distributions for each management cycle. This one here is for the limit reference point, so you can see there's much less than a 10% probability of exceeding the limit fishing mortality reference point. So in terms of status and safety of the fishing mortality rate part of the Kobe plot and the limit reference point, the yellowfin stock requiring the most restrictive management is safe and has good status. We also did these analyses for when we removed the limit on how much fishing mortality could decrease over time, but I haven't got those here in the presentation. Okay, so in terms of why we'd want to do multi-species management. So if we increase the fishing mortality, would we get any extra yield out of the other stocks? Because we're keeping in mind that big eye tuna is not the stock we want to maximize the catch. We really want to maximize the catch of yellowfin in the dolphin associated fishery and maximize the catch of skipjack in the floating object fishery. It's a little more complicated than that because it's, total tuna is more important maybe than just the skipjack. But in general, that's the majority of the catch of those fleets. So that's what we're trying to maximize. For yellowfin tuna, this is 3 different scenarios with a different steepness of the stock recruitment relationship. Along the bottom is the fishing mortality relative to the current fishing mortality. So 1 is the current value. And then the first line here is the fishing mortality relative to fishing at F 30%. And then this line here is somehow related to the maximum fishing mortality, which is MSY, but it sort of flattens off here. So the calculation was a little bit off. And then the yield on the y-axis. And so you can see here that increasing the fishing mortality to F30 or to even higher, like FMSY, doesn't really increase the yield by that much. And then with the steepness, instead of having a flat yield curve, we go to more dome-shaped ones. But because the fishing mortality is fairly close to the current one, the yield isn't increasing that much either. However, for skipjack tuna, it's a different story. So you can see here, again, this is the current fishing mortality, and this is F30, which is also our proxy for MSY. You can see here that the yield can be greatly increased if we fish at F30%. And in all, on average, over all the different models we have in the assessment, there's about a 50% increase in catch. And so there is potential for a great increase in the skipjack catch based on the current understanding of the skipjack population and the fishery. Okay, shall we stop here just in case?
Unless the chair proposes otherwise, maybe you should just finish with the review of what are we proposing, and then we just open for discussion.
It's up to you, Shana.
Yes, I'm nodding. I think you should go ahead and do this section as well, please.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So looking at the so I'm going to go over some sort of concepts in terms of how we came up with our final proposal. And so the first one here is this the fact that decreasing the closure, or basically eliminating the closure in the first management cycle, provides us with performance metrics that are very similar to just limiting it to a 10-day reduction. Okay, and so this is the comparison of those. Again, it's pretty safe, and we're in the green part of the Kobe plot a lot of the time, depending on what your objectives are. But if you just want to oscillate around the targets, then 50% is kind of reasonable. This is a lot higher than 50%. These are very similar. That's similar as well. And so the big difference really is the days of closure, right? So one has average of 43 days because it takes so long to get to the equilibrium, and the other one gets straight there, so it only has a few days of closure. So that's really what we kind of focused on, is the days of closure. So how do we choose what days of closure and how fast to get to elimination of the closure if that's what we desire? So one way of looking at it is looking at the probability of a certain days of closure and how much of a change that would be. So for example, this here is the right-hand part of the probability distribution for days of closure. And this is a cumulative probabilities in the sense that the x-axis is the days of closure, and this is the probability that the days of closure is that value or greater. So if you take this point here, there's nearly a 40% chance that you're going to have a closure, right? Whereas here, there is a 17% probability that the closure is going to be greater than the 72-day closure, which we've had for a long time. So there's still a possibility that if we got perfect information, that we'd have to close the fishery for 72 days or more, based on the F30% target, right? Another one here is if you say thinking what kind of probabilities are something we want to be concerned about. Well, there's a possibility that say 20% probability of something is maybe a probability that you would want to use for management advice, and in that case, there's a 20% probability that the closure would be 50 days or more, right? So we can do a lot of these different calculations, and so this is kind of the one that we went with. We thought that what's the probability of the closure having to increase by 10 days or more, because 10 days is what we've seen in the past, a change in closure days that people don't like or stakeholders don't like, right? And so if we get down to 40%, there's a 20% chance that the closure is going to be either 10 days, which is the difference between these two, or larger. And so that's kind of why we've chosen the 40% as the target closure in 2 management cycles.
40 days.
40 days in 2
So 40%.
Oh, sorry, 40 days, sorry, in 2 management cycles. Okay. So that's kind of the concept in terms of what we're thinking about in determining how fast to get to a elimination of the closure. Now, in terms of making this a multi-stock management procedure. So remember, we've only done formal MSE for big eye tuna, but we have done some interim multi-species MSE in terms of skipjack and yellowfin. But one way to think about this also is if we're looking at this F30 S20 harvest control rule that we're proposing. So we proposed that last year, not based on MSE, but based on what we thought was the best information we had available, so the best scientific information to choose a harvest control rule. So if you read the document that we did there, you can get an idea of why we chose that. So conceptually, it's a good harvest control rule. We tested it. It works well for big eye tuna. It's also been it's very similar, if not the same, as harvest control rules that have been used in the MSE for Pacific bluefin tuna. So it works well for them. And also the interim multi-species MSE showed it worked well as well. So in general, this is a very well-performing harvest control rule. The other reason for doing this is because what would we do if we introduced the management procedure for Big Eye for the other stocks? And so by including the other stocks in there, this is more a precautionary approach. It's also this harvest control rule is more conservative than, say, the current harvest control rule, which says fish at FMSY. Okay. So I'm going to go through a hypothetical example of how we would implement this multi-species management procedure. And so at the top there, we've got the different management cycles. And so there's 3 years within each of these management cycles. And in each management cycle, the management procedure is evaluated to determine the management for the next management cycle of 3 years. So what we're saying is that in the first management cycle, we would go down to 50 days of closure, right? And so there'll be 3 years of 50 days of closure. So at the end of that, we would then do update assessments for all 3 species, and we would take the results from the Big Eye update assessment, and we'd evaluate the F30 S20 harvest control rule and determine how many days of closure that implies. And so in this case, it's 20. We do the same thing for yellowfin, and it's at 32, which is what we might expect because yellowfin is this species of of highest concern. And then skipjack, we do the assessment and apply the harvest control rule, and we get 0 days of closure. So in that case, the largest closure is for yellowfin, 32 days, but because that's more than a 10-day reduction from the 50, we only allow a 10-day reduction, and so we'd go to 40. So there'd be 40 days of closure for 3 years in the next management zone. And then at the end of that, we do the same thing again. We do the 3 assessments, but in this case, during that 6-year period, we've developed we've done some more research, we've improved the assessments, and we do a benchmark assessment. We may have actually done a new MSE based on that and developed a new harvest management procedure. But based on what we know now, we're thinking that there would be a 20% chance that we'd have to go to 50 days or more, which is how we decided on the 40 days, right? And then this is based on the southwest stock of yellowfin tuna, and there'd be an 80% chance that we'd actually reduce the closure, right? So that's what we're expecting from the current information. Obviously, that's just probabilities, not what's going to happen. So we would do the assessments, and again, this is new benchmark assessments in this case. We applied the harvest control rule to each species or each stock for that assessment. And in this case, yellowfin had the largest closure, which was 32 days, but this is not more than 10 days less than the 40, so we'd actually take those days of closure. So for the next 3 years, we'd have 32 days of closure. Okay, and then we apply it again. We do the update assessments, we apply the rules, and we get the closures. But in this case, the harvest control rule for yellowfin says that the closure day should be 37. So in this hypothetical example, we'd actually increase the days of closure in that 4th management zone. And so we just keep doing that. And periodically, you might want to do benchmark assessments and reevaluate the management procedure. But also keep in mind that during each of these years and each of these management cycles, we would be monitoring the population under different things like the indicators and things like that. And exceptional circumstances might come in and require further research, further analysis, maybe update assessments, maybe reevaluating the management procedure and harvest control rules and whatever. Okay, stop there. I think we should, right?
No, that is very short, right?
Yeah, it's pretty short, I think.
That's
Okay. Okay. So yeah, at this act, there was concern that we weren't taking into consideration what was going to happen to the management of the longline fishery. So the first point here is we're basically using the same harvest control rule to modify the country-specific limits for big eye tuna in the longline fishery. And so if the population size is greater than 20%, then we're going to use the current country limits as they are. But if the stock goes below 20%, then we're going to reduce those limits until we get zero at zero biomass. Okay, so basically the same as we're applying for the fishing mortality on percentage. So this gives you an idea of what the catch will be in the longline fishery. And so this is time along the bottom in years. This is the current, like 2004, I guess, was when the time of the last period in the MSE. And this is the forward projections of the MSE, with the lines being the management cycles. And so you can see that the catch of longline was very high in the 1990s, and it declined as the population declined and the effort reduced. But because of the high recruitment and the reduction in fishing mortality caused by the IVT, the population is going to be rebuilding very quickly, and the catch in the longline fisheries is also going to increase very rapidly. Due to technical issues, we didn't constrain the longline catch at its limit. And so basically the assumption was that the fishing effort in the longline fishery basically increased at the same rate as the fishing effort in the purse seine fishery did. Okay, but the thing to note here is if the fishing effort in the longline fishery increases like that, and this is with the 10-day closure limit, that the longline catch will get to a level that is a little bit less on average, that is, well, a little bit less than the total of all the country catch limits. Okay, so that seems like the catch limits are actually somewhat reasonable in terms of the management of big eye if things follow the assumptions in the management strategy evaluation. One issue here is that not all countries are catching their limits, and there is a restriction on how much longline catch can be transferred between countries, and so it's may not be possible that the longline catch limit or the total longline catch limit can be reached. And so one consideration that the Commission needs to make is whether or not that needs to be modified so that the total catch limit can be obtained.
Is it the timeline?
This is complete summary of the list. Do you want to do this?
Is it a repeat?
It's just a summary, but
Okay,
it's got more details.
summarize it.
Okay. So yeah, that was a long presentation on lots of different components. But this slide here summarizes the management procedure. And so the management cycle is going to be okay, so this is a proposal. So the management cycle is proposed to be 3 years. The initial application is going to be 2 cycles, which is 6 years. And then after that, things could be evaluated and modifications if required. Starting next year in 2027, in the first management cycle, there would be a 50-day closure. In the second and future cycles would follow basically the harvest control management procedure. And so the F30S20 harvest control rule would be applied independently to each of the stocks, including the Northeast and Southwest yellowfin stocks. The management adopted would be based on the stock requiring the most restrictive management. The estimation models would be updates of the risk analysis. And when we say update, it means exactly the same as the most recent assessment, except we include updated data and new data for that extra year, or I guess in this case, extra 3 years. Would have a 10-day maximum change in closure days, except for when the spawning biomass is below 20%, where there'd be a maximum increase of possibility of 20 days. And we would retain the current CPC longline catch limits, except for when the spawning biomass goes below 20%, as illustrated in that figure. And again, we'd recommend allowing full utilization of the longline catch limits in however the stakeholders agree is appropriate. And that's just reiterating the harvest control rule with a reduction in either fishing mortality or catch limits when the biomass goes less than 20%. And so something to highlight here to make sure that people understand that during this initial period, there's going to be additional work and the possibility of updating the management and management procedure based on that information. And so within the 2-cycle 6-year period, we'd improve the science. So that's collecting new types of data to greatly reduce the uncertainty in the stock assessments, and do benchmark assessments to base new multi-species management strategy evaluations on. We'd also develop multi-species objectives. And so, things like, whether maximizing the catch in the longline fishery for big eye and maximizing the catch of skipjack in the floating object fisheries, things like that, that are more specific to the different species and stocks as opposed to overall objectives. But also to be able to obtain these more precise objectives, we also need more precise management actions like the IBT, which is specifically developed to reduce the catch of big eye tuna so we can increase the catch of skipjack. And we would update the management procedure if necessary. So if the multi-species and objectives and the multi-species MSE suggest a different management procedure, then that would be adopted and applied in the future. Okay, let's talk about that.
Okay, Shana, I see it's 10 to the hour, a time when I assume you were going to do a break. So you may consider doing the break now and then coming back for a long discussion. Up to you.
Sure, we can do that. I'm guessing Mark at least could use a break after that presentation. Let's say 5 minutes if possible, just a quick break, coming back at what is that, 2:55 p.m. Pacific time, please. So 5 or 6 minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to go over the exceptional circumstances. These are, I think most of them, if not all of them, are described in our document from last year, from the last year's annual meeting, on our proposed harvest control rule. And so we've grouped these into sort of common exceptional circumstances. And so an exceptional circumstances is something that's not included in the management procedure but is something that might invalidate the management procedure in some ways. So you would have to take additional action or evaluations or anything to determine whether the management's still appropriate. And so you will have something that happens like you've exceeded some kind of level or something like that. And then there's also the action you take if that occurred. It's kind of very difficult to prescribe explicitly what happens and then what exactly you should do. It's like, if the catch per unit effort increased 1,000 times, then you would reduce the fishing by 90% or something like that. It's very difficult to apply that to every type of exceptional circumstance. So in general, most of the exceptional circumstances we're talking about is something occurs and then the staff will evaluate that in some way, which might mean just looking at some other data. It may require some additional analyses, things like that. And it may even come down to doing new benchmark assessments and new management strategy evaluation to determine whether the current management procedure is still valid or if we have to change that management procedure. So it depends a lot on what the exceptional circumstance is and how badly it has been exceeded or breached, what you'd want to do. But and most of the time it would require the staff doing analyses, and it's not just a set of analyses, it's a hierarchy of analyses. You might do a simple analysis first and it might say everything's okay, so you don't have to do anything else. But it might say, well, it looks like something's not going well, so then we have to do another analysis or a data collection or something to determine whether or not the management procedure is still appropriate. So it's very difficult for us to specifically outline exactly what would happen if an exceptional circumstance is breached. And sometimes it's even difficult to say if an exceptional circumstance is breached. So anyway, with that in mind, I'm going to go through the exceptional circumstances. So the first one here is related to limit reference points. And this is basically the same as what's currently in the interim harvest control rules, which were already adopted in a resolution previously. So if the probability of exceeding a limit reference point, either a target or a fishing mortality, is greater than 10%, then a rebuilding plan must be developed to restore the stock within 2 generations. So basically we're in a place that we didn't think we'd get under the harvest control rules. So therefore we have to reevaluate how we're going to rebuild the population to a good level, which might require something more conservative than the harvest control rule actually specifies.
Yeah. This is already in the current harvest control rule.
Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah. The next one is something it's more of a safeguard. We know that the population didn't collapse under, and these are all for big eye tuna, so they could be somehow applied to the other stocks if we wanted to as well, but these ones were mainly developed for big eye. But here, this one's more of a safeguard because we know that the stock didn't collapse with the high fishing mortality rates in 2019 and 2021, but we don't know what would happen to the stock if the fishing mortality exceeds that. There is a possibility that the harvest control rule, even though it's fishing at F30%, might say that fishing mortality level is higher than we've seen in the past. And we probably don't want to fish higher than we've seen in the past until we greatly reduce the uncertainty in the assessment. And so if the harvest control rule says you should be fishing at a level it's greater than the average from 2019 to 2021, we would readjust that fishing mortality from the harvest control rule to that level, so to make sure that we didn't go above it. So the next set is related to whether or not the stock assessments or the management procedure is determined to be not working as we expected. And we've got this under 3 different temporal levels. So the one at the bottom is basically something that would happen on an annual basis. So remember, we're not reevaluating the harvest management procedure or the harvest control rule each year. We're doing it at the end of each management cycle and fixing it for the next 3 years, right? But we want to make sure every year that we're checking to make sure nothing bad happens, right? And so on an annual basis, we would still evaluate the stock status indicators, which we've been doing for a long time now. And if an indicator falls outside the historical range, particularly what we haven't defined these, but particularly ones that suggest that something indicating that something the status or the safety of the stock is being compromised, we would reevaluate that particular stock, and that might mean simply just interpreting the indicators, but also might mean do an update assessment and so on. In each management cycle, we are going to have to run an estimation model, which is basically what we are proposing is an update assessment, which includes a full risk analysis. So that's running all the different models in the risk analysis. So by doing that, we're actually doing an assessment. So it's similar to what we're doing now, right? And so if that suggests that the management procedure is actually not working anymore, then again, we'd have to reevaluate everything. And then finally, periodically, we will conduct benchmark assessments if new information is available or if some other information suggests that there's some issues. And again, if the benchmark assessment suggests that the management procedure is no longer appropriate, then we would reevaluate things. So this is more related to the management measures being ineffective or unreliable data. And so for the first one is if the IVT is deemed to not be effective anymore for a number of different reasons. Again, we would reevaluate. And this, as Alex mentioned, this may actually just be reevaluating how the IVT is implemented, not necessarily reevaluating the assessments or the data or anything like that, right? The next one is data availability. There's a whole lot of different types of data we're using in the assessments and also to evaluate whether or not the management procedure is still operating appropriately. So, for example, it's important to collect information from the purse seine fishery on the catch levels so that we can use that to evaluate the management procedure. So if, for example, the integrated port sampling program is discontinued, that would compromise our ability to evaluate the harvest control rule. So that might be a reason for reevaluating everything, which might actually mean reverting back to the management measures in 2025 before we reduce them based on the success of the IVT. One of the main data sources or used in the stock assessment are the CPOE indices of relative abundance. And if for some reason an index for one of the stocks becomes unreliable, we would have to reevaluate the assessments and possibly the management procedure. So in terms of sort of management issues, so we have experience in the past, and this was because the introduction of the IVT was part of this, is that if the harvest control rule suggests closures greater than 72 days, that seems not acceptable by stakeholders. So we'd have to reevaluate how we manage the stock, which might include alternative management measures other than closures. Also, we didn't do a lot of explicit evaluation of the longline fishery management in the MSE, and there are some concerns that the catch in the longline fisheries is going to increase, and if effort in those fisheries increases even more, then the catches might increase more. So an exceptional circumstance would be when the total catch of the longline fishery exceeded the global catch limit, which was deemed to be appropriate in the MSEs. We would have to reevaluate the management in the longline fisheries. So the first one up here was brought up at the SAC, where the MSE is based on the fact that the IVT has been very successful, and so the population would increase rapidly. However, if the population doesn't increase as rapidly as we expected, that indicates that perhaps the management strategy evaluation may be biased. And so one possibility is to continue to evaluate the indices of abundance on an annual basis. So this is before an update assessment has occurred, and we can tell from the update assessment how this is operating. So looking at the CPUE index on an annual basis within that time period, if it doesn't increase as much as we expected in the MSE, then that suggests that there might be some issues with the assessments in the MSE. So we would reevaluate the assessments and management procedure. In this particular case, we could be fairly prescriptive about what we are thinking. And so, for example, if the CPUE falls below, 80% of what we expected, or whatever, in this case, below the 20 percentile of what we expected, then we would reevaluate things. Another one on excessive fishing mortality. And so we have in the harvest control rule that there's a minimum change of 20 days unless we go below the 20% spawning biomass, where there's a minimum of 20 days increase in the closure. So if the harvest control rule actually says that we should be increasing the days of closure by 20 days or more, that indicates this might be a concern. So we might want to reevaluate the management procedure there. And again, when I say reevaluate, it doesn't mean we're going to change the management procedure. It means that the staff will do some analyses or investigations to make sure that the management procedure is still appropriate. So we're not actually, it doesn't mean we're going to do an MSE, we're going to test a new management procedure and we're going to adopt. We just want to double check to make sure things are not bad. And if things are bad, then we might go down the road of doing all those other things. And again, I think we mentioned this before in one of the previous slides, that we're going to do an update assessment every 3 years. So if that suggests that the fishing mortality increased substantially above the F30 level, we want to reevaluate that management procedure. But I guess that's kind of related to the previous one because it would possibly be suggesting more than a 20-day reduction in pollution. Yeah. So and we're still working on exceptional circumstances. So there may be other exceptional circumstances that we haven't included. One example might be whether a bycatch species becomes a concern that might require reevaluating the management procedure. And I'm sure there's some others that we can think of too. And I think we probably I mean, there's a lot of things in a management procedure. I mean, we've gone through a whole lot of things today. And some of them are fairly logical and straightforward and have been tested and other people have used them. And so they kind of should be fairly easy to adopt. Other things are a little harder to adopt. And exceptional circumstances tend to be more difficult to adopt because it's very hard to prescribe them. And some commissions have adopted components of management procedures step by step. I mean, I think we're recommending that most of the components of the harvest strategy that we've presented should be adopted as one unit. But the exceptional circumstances may be something that can be added to over time. And even within the first 3 years, we don't have to wait till 6 years to adopt them. I mean, we may be able to adopt some this year, maybe next year we can adopt more, things like that. So, yeah. Okay, so this is the basically the what we propose in terms of the timeline over the 6 years or so for the interim part of the management procedure. And so the first line is the days of closure. Then this next one is the risk analysis and MSE and I think stock assessments. And this is the research is the third line, and the fourth line is talking about management. And so as we sort of went over in the presentation, we're recommending a 50-day closure for the first management cycle of 3 years, and then applying the harvest control rule for the next 3 years. And because of the 10 days of closure maximum change, there would be a minimum of 40 days of closure. So it may be more days of closure depending on how the harvest control rule was, the results from evaluating that. And then in the 2033, which is the start of the third management cycle, we would implement the management procedure, and it could be a new one depending on the evaluations in the previous years. In terms of the evaluations and the MSE and stuff, so not sure what this is for the revision. So in 2027, what does it say?
Workshop.
Oh, okay, yes. I just added this today, so I wasn't quite sure what it was. Sorry. So we're actually trying to get some funding from the EU to have a workshop next year on a review of the management strategy evaluation approach that we've got, which we would try and include more of a workshop to provide improvements on that. So it's sort of more of an extension of a review rather than just a review. So again, this would provide us a lot for information to be able to update the MSE, particularly a multi-species MSE. And then in 2029, for all of the stocks, we'd do a stock assessment, and then we'd which would be a full risk analysis, and then we'd evaluate the harvest control rule based on that. Then over that 6-year period, because we're doing additional data collection and research, we would do a benchmark assessment in 2031, and then the following year we would update the management strategy evaluation, and a
Multi-species.
a multi-species management strategy evaluation. Okay, and then as far as research goes, so we really need to improve the stock assessments to be able to more precisely manage these fisheries. And there's now that, so big-eye tuna was always the species of concern, so we spent a lot of time trying to improve that assessment and less focus on yellowfin and skipjack. But now, because of the IVT, this yellowfin assessment is becoming more important, and so we're going to put more emphasis on that. Also, currently we have a tagging program that will be hopefully starting next year, which will provide us better information for skipjack, as well as some information on the other species as well. So there's a tagging program for on floating objects. Then we also would like to improve our estimates of growth and aging, and that would help us a lot reduce the uncertainty in the assessments. And then in 2029, one of the issues with the floating object fishery is it doesn't provide information on large fish. And so we want to tag large yellowfin to get a good estimate of absolute abundance and other related things like stock status, stock structure and natural mortality. So we would like to implement a tagging program focused on yellowfin tuna in 2029. And so that would give us time to collect the data and evaluate that information to put into the benchmark assessments to improve the assessments. In terms of management, so next year we would like to initiate the development of management objectives, of multi-species management objectives. So moving from the big eye objectives that we're discussing now to multi-species, multi-stock objectives. And then once those have been defined, then we can better define the actual management actions that would be able to achieve those management objectives. So we'd like to start developing those fairly soon, so that once we've done the multi-species management strategy evaluation, then we can actually implement those management objectives in 2033. So that's essentially the outline that we're proposing in terms of analyses, research, and management aspects.